Two key concepts in behaviorism are classical conditioning and operant conditioning. We typically teach classical conditioning first because it was the first historically. Now, classical conditioning works on our reflexes, our automatic responses. The most well-known example is Pavlov's dog. To give you a little bit of a backstory, imagine that someone's trying to evaluate what dog food a dog likes best. How do you do that? Well, one way that you could do it is to present the dog with different dog foods and evaluate how much they salivate. The more a dog salivates, the more it must like that food. And this is sort of what Pavlov was doing. So the process was a man in a white lab coat would come in and bring food. The dog would eat the food, collect the saliva, and see how much the dog salivated. More saliva, must like that food better. What Pavlov noticed was when the man in the white lab coat would walk in, even without food though, the dog would start to salivate. Why? If I'm wearing a white jacket and I'm walking down the street and I run into a dog, I wouldn't expect the dog to start salivating. So what's happened here? What Pavlov suggested is the dog has learned to associate that white lab coat with I'm gonna eat. And what happens is that response, that automatic response to the food is now elicited by that white lab coat. Classical conditioning is probably less used in educational contexts than operant conditioning, but there are still some applications. Remember, classical conditioning is about our automatic responses. So for something that's really anxiety-provoking, perhaps it could be reading or presenting, what you can do is set up situations that are more relaxing. If you set up a comfy and inviting reading corner or an inviting presentation atmosphere, then you can start to associate that presentation or reading with something that's actually quite relaxing or something more positive. So we're using those classical conditioning principles to try and associate an automatic response with something that didn't used to be there. In operant conditioning, what we're doing is we're having an influence on behaviors where there's a choice. So we're not talking about those automatic or reflexive behaviors anymore, but things that you choose to do. The most famous example here is Skinner's box. He wondered if he could train a rat to press a lever to get a pellet of food. So he designed this box, and in the box he placed a rat. If the rat presses this lever, a pellet of food drops down. So how do you go about training a rat? You can't just tell it, please press the lever. So he went about training this rat to press the lever by rewarding what he called successive approximations. Everything the rat did that got closer and closer to the desired behavior, the rat would be rewarded with a pellet of food until it eventually presses that lever, and out comes some food. What happens next? Well, the rat keeps pressing that lever. It's getting rewarded each and every time. So he called this positive reinforcement, what we typically term a reward, but he used the term reinforcement. Positive reinforcement is where we add something desirable to the situation. In this case, it was a pellet of food, with the goal of strengthening that response, making it more likely to happen again. There's another form of reward, though, called negative reinforcement. And don't get caught up on that word negative, because it's still a type of reward. But it's a reward by removing something undesirable from the situation. But it's still intended to strengthen that response, make it more likely to happen. He also talked about two types of punishment. We can call them positive punishment or type 1 punishment, and negative punishment or type 2 punishment. Positive punishment is about adding something undesirable to the situation, scolding, as an example. And the goal here is to weaken a behavior, make it less likely to happen again. Negative punishment is taking away something desirable, removing privileges, removing something that the individual wants, again to weaken that behavior, make that behavior less likely to occur again. There's two key points to keep in mind. Number one, we've talked about rewards and punishments, but what we use for rewards and punishments depends upon the individual. it has to be something that they value. For example, if you're attempting to punish a student by removing them from class, but what they really wanted was to get out of class, what you've actually done is rewarded or reinforced that behavior. You've strengthened it, made it more likely to happen again. By the same token, if you reward someone with a sticker and they place no value on that sticker, it's going to have very little, if any, benefit in terms of strengthening that response. So the individual needs to value that thing that you're using for reinforcement or punishment. The second thing is we need to be careful about an over-reliance on these operant conditioning principles. When we rely too heavily on these principles, what happens is we start to assign value to the things that we do, and those values are those rewards and punishments. So we need to use these things carefully in the classroom.